Greetings, humans.
Welcome to another episode of Humans of the Multiverse, where we share the stories of our friends from all over the globe.
We hope you find this conversation interesting and uplifting. Our goal is to bring people together, so if you enjoy the interview, we'd love to hear your comments.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.
This week, we are pleased to present the work of one of our new friends and peers, Peter, who is an independent researcher and YouTuber based in the St. Louis area. Check out his channel, Enigma Seeker, for interesting videos about ancient history and anomalous phenomena. This interview covers Peter's hypothesis on ancient Atlantis and Eden being located in Egypt. Enjoy the show.
Yeah, if you get a chance, if you're on I-55 in St. Louis, stop at Sugarloaf Mound. It's so unusual.
Please. Thank you.
It's a small mound, but there's a house on top of it.
Oh, wow.
And the old lady is not leaving until she's dead. And then she said, then the damn city can take the land. They're trying to get her out because she lives in this house. I've talked to her once. And there's basically made a deal with her saying once she passes, then the inheritance of the land will go to this, I guess the state or the city. And then they're going to make it into a national preserve or whatever for Native American mound.
She's obviously not superstitious then, because that seems like bad mojo, doesn't it?
I don't know. Yeah, I haven't talked to her about that, but yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. The site's called Sugarloaf Mound. I think Rebirth knows about it.
Do you know how old the lady is today?
I haven't seen her in over 3 years, so I don't. I don't know. I just happened to drive by, and just stepped out of the car and told her that I study landscape architecture. And I'm just interested in sites like this.
Right. What was your impressions of Serpent Mound? What did you do there?
Oh, I mean, I have relatives in Cincinnati, so we've visited a few times, and yeah, it's an interesting site. I know there's legends of sea serpents in Lake Erie. There's some weird stories, cryptid stories. Makes you wonder if the Native Americans were inspired by that. I kind of disagree with Graham Hancock on the whole alignment stuff. I think it's something a little more paranormal is what the Native Americans believed in.
Okay. What is it about the alignments that you disagree with?
Well, it's like, I don't know. It's like you could say it's aligned to this. Sure, it might have been aligned to something in general, the equinox, but I don't think that was the main priority of the symbolism of the serpent, because we know that serpent symbolism comes from Central America. At the pyramids down there. And I bet that religious kind of motif spread up to there. Now the question is, why did they choose? I mean, why did they choose the serpent or the feathered plume serpent, Quetzalcoatl?
Right.
It's kind of interesting that I could see why Graham Hancock connects. Like, is there some connection with Egypt or something with the old world, and then somehow that religion spread? Or is it something more universal? Like if you believe in UFOs or the supernatural, then they just naturally correlated snakes because snakes shed their skin, represents immortality, and they're kind of powerful looking and scary. So it represents the power of the chieftains and the shamans. But it could be a universal icon. Yeah.
I think that's a cool perspective. And Dave and I are obviously into enigmas like you. What kind of inspired you to start looking into these enigmas? And then what enigma are you going to share with us tonight?
Yeah, well, originally it was my actual UFO experience. I consider myself an eyewitness of the second kind from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, originally. And I witnessed something pretty freaky. And that opens your minds. And there's something definitely out there as preached by every religion in the world. And now the Pentagon is now talking about it for the first time, which is pretty historic, to say the least. So yeah, that event sparked my YouTube channel to investigate UFOs and a little bit of the paranormal and see how they might be related. But then when I got to college, I was really interested in anthropology. I ran across Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock. I used to fall for their ideas. I no longer really agree anymore because I started looking into Atlantis. You know, naturally, I was just because of curiosity of movies and shows. There's an anime called Nadia. There's Disney's Atlantis, which was a copy off of the Japanese one, but you know. And then there's Jules Verne. Obviously, that's one of my favorite books. So that got me into the topic. But then I actually took the time in college, since I was studying some anthropology and a little bit of political science. So we learned about Plato and philosophy. And I actually took the time to read Plato, and I'm like, I think Randall and Graham, I think you're leaving a few details out that Plato said. So we can get into the topic of Atlantis now, and that's how it kind of all started in college.
For sure. Before we do, are you comfortable telling us about your experience or
for
the second
UFOs?
kind? That is,
yes?
Oh.
Yeah.
We're super into that, and we respect it. We have your slides pulled
That
up.
might
ready
be
to go.
good for
If you wanna do
another.
it.
That might be good for another talk because that's pretty involved.
Sure.
Let's just say I was a psionic. Yeah, all that means is summoning and praying to the gods. And once in a while, it's like you've seen Stranger Things.
Yes.
You know the character Vecna. So Vecna's scanning around, looking for people and prowling around, and that somehow the UAPs have that ability to detect when people are trying to summon them or trying to psionically, psychically connect with them or pray to summon. Praying and psychicness is the difference between praying is you're not trying to intentionally summon, but with psionics, you're intentionally asking them to send a physical sign. And that's what I did, that experiment over Iowa. Freaked out my neighbors. They heard the booms. My sister saw something in the woods. It was red. And then I had a big gust of wind. Everything went dead silent. And then all of a sudden, big red orb the size of a car, about maybe 200 feet away, 100 feet high, just above the treetops. Looked like the Star of Bethlehem, but very close. It was just slowly moving. It was disturbing because it was like, that's not a drone. That was not a drone. And I report to MUFON. I even called the FBI, told about my case. And then the thing kind of followed me when I was in the Air Force. Down at Lackland, I had the experience there. I was in formation. And I was, again, trying that experiment, asking it to manifest. Like, send me a sign, send me a sign. And what it did is it sent three white orbs, triangle formation, turned on right as we were in parade formation at night, taking down the flag. And then once the parade formation ended, that's when it shut the lights off. And I asked others if they saw it, and like 3 other guys saw it, but they just didn't think about it because I was the one summoning it. But it took about 2 days to think about it. I was watching some videos probably. This was after basic training. And then, I was getting into UFOs, being in the Air Force, you start thinking about this. But then I realized this phenomenon it's definitely not related to intrinsically biological extraterrestrials from another planet. It's definitely not. After I've listened to Jacques Vallée, Lou Alessandro, David Grush, Jeremy Corbell, even they use the word aliens, but they're dodging something very specific: extraterrestrial life forms from another planet. They're starting to dodge it. Lou said, well, maybe it's not from outer space. Maybe it's right here. I'm like, okay, now we're tampering with religion, the spiritual realm, what the Native Americans believed in. And I'm like, okay, this phenomenon's nothing new. And if you don't summon it, it will stay away. It will respect your boundaries. But if you summon it, you don't know if you're going to get the yin or the yang, which one, the demon or the angel. And it really opened my eyes to my faith as a Catholic. I wasn't very strong until I witnessed this event. And I'm like, okay, none of this makes logical sense that it would be aliens from another planet. They shouldn't be playing, Marco Polo and hide and seek in my backyard. Okay, that's not the behavior of a civilization. And Gary Nolan said that I wouldn't call this a civilization. I would call it a consciousness. Or he avoided the word spirit, but consciousness and spirit is kind of the same thing. In religious terminology. So that's where I learned. I'm pretty adamant that this phenomenon is not intrinsically biological, but it does have the power to produce biologic avatars, which is very rare, extremely rare. I've looked into it a lot. Bigfoot's, Greys, and I think the Stan Romanek case, I think his footage is legit. The autopsy alien one that videographers analyze, I think that's pretty legit. I think they're literal biologics, but they're not. They're just turning
from another planet.
No, I think when David Grush alluded to the phrase interdimensional, he was
I
winking.
know.
And there's a reason why they chose David Grush, because he studies physics.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
they
mhm.
chose him specifically because of that. And they were trying to allude to that. And when the documentary comes out, Age of Disclosure, listen closely to what Clapper says and Mullen and Lou, and you'll see that this is not how aliens would reveal themselves. Like, oh, the
Right.
Pentagon's gonna make some documentaries and stuff and reveal it over 5-6 years. No, real aliens would just would just take over the world.
That's one of the exact things that Dave and I are following, as we're like glad to see the government acknowledging these things, whereas it was outright denial and disinformation for many decades. But we're still skeptical of the true intentions of everybody involved. And
I think after the Nazis, they started digging very deep into it, because the Nazis were into the occult and magic and summoning paranormal things.
Well,
and once they realized what the Nazis were doing, the U.S. started doing it.
Oh yeah.
And the Soviets.
Right. So you, so I know we're here to do your presentation, but I just wanted to ask. I saw an a reply or something on X that you had made about
Ricardo?
the government.
Oh.
Not that, the government's involvement as far as like fighting an interdimensional war or something like that. Is that something you want to expound upon right now, or?
Jeremy Corbell in his documentaries made statements, and I don't think Lou has made the statement yet, but he was alluding that there's some kind of disinformation that might be coming about where people think that there's a false flag alien invasion coming from outer space.
Sometimes I think that. I go back and forth. I flip-flop all the time, but like sometimes I think
Werner von Braun talked about it on his deathbed, but that's
I think what they're alluding to is the UAPs themselves, the evil ones, are intentionally transforming into certain biologics that look extraterrestrial to us, like the footage from the Roswell footage potentially, the case where that one agent came out in the 80s and he was talking. He had his face covered. Oh, what was his name? His pseudonym. But he was also applying that there's literally biological aliens, but they're not concerned about death because they seem to jump from vessel to vessel. So when I hear terminologies like that as a Catholic, it's pretty clear we're talking about angels and demons. Angels have the power to conjure up matter, suspend the laws of physics within limited time and space. They're not all powerful, and they're basically the gods of ancient past, the gods of Egypt. But they're not the big Amun Aten, the Amun Ra. They are the lesser gods, and they're limited within their power. And we can get into that a little bit later. I have one last slide on that, but I think it connects back to Egypt, definitely. The Egyptians were very clear that there are literal gods, but the symbology and the art gets people so confused. That's like, wait, do you mean they literally worship the sun? Like, no, the sun's a symbol. With the wings represent the Aten, and that symbolizes these orbs of light. They default into a plasma orb, and they're basically pure energy, but they somehow have the power to conjure up metal. And Gary Nolan alludes to this, that there's slags of metal being dropped intentionally by these UAPs. They're morphing the metal, and like Avatar: Last Airbender, metal benders or whatever. They can change the density, and they can split, fuse, expand, shrink. And I think FBI agent John D'Souza also talks about this. I presented on my channel. So it's getting pretty clear that what we're seeing is something more like Terminator and my favorite movie, Alita Battle Angel, where they have the power to morph their body, like Terminator and Alita. So, but they're not intrinsically human. But somehow they have the power to simply conjure up physical biologics. The question is, are they possessing the body, or is the body just a vessel? It's empty. There's no soul in it, or it's already dead. So it doesn't make sense that they would just crash. it doesn't make sense.
That's never made sense to me. I wanted to comment on you mentioning the metal thing and dropping metal. That there's a famous case of that in Iowa. Do you know anything about that case, Peter?
Well, I know the recent one in New Jersey of all the so-called drones. There's a case there in the UK too. But
Okay.
Iowa, no, I'm not aware of the Iowa one.
I'll look it up later and send it to you.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm talking about, Mike? I saw it on some kind of UAP documentary investigation, and there was some strange metal that they found on the side of the road, like that seemed to have been dropped from an orb, and they run it through a bunch of laboratory experiments. And this was a few years ago, so I don't want to like speak too much on it. I'll find it and send it to you. But this literally happened in Iowa. I think I told you too. Go ahead.
Is this a case that Gary Nolan has talked about or no?
I don't know for sure.
Okay.
I'll go. I'm gonna have to. I'm like drawn on like a couple years ago memory.
Okay.
It may have been Gary Nolan though. I'm trying to remember either way. I'm from Iowa too, so I know you
cool.
graduated from Iowa State and Iowa, right?
Yeah. So Iowa was just my bachelor's. I went in the Air Force, did Air Force ROTC, and I studied basically political science with some political philosophy and took some anthropology classes. So that's what kind of led me to getting interested in Plato. Of course, before that was entertainment reasons that got me interested.
Sure.
And then when I went to Iowa State for my master's, I studied landscape architecture and garden history. And that's where I started to open up the connection between Atlantis and the biblical stories. And I'm like, okay, I'm seeing where Plato is getting his ideas from. And it's not from the West, as Randall Carlson wants to think. It's from the East. And the reason I say this is because, like I present here in college, you don't necessarily learn. Did I learn that Atlantis is Egypt? No, but it's a hypothesis that started popping up in my head because I started finding researchers and I started thinking critically as I learned about garden history. So there's certain methodologies we learn in college. The idea of trying to be realistic and rational with some common sense and logic to present, and we have to keep in mind certain methodologies like historian's fallacy, law of proximity, geopolitical context, and even religious context, sort of supernatural, but also natural events, and providing other details like cross-pollination we need to consider with the geography. We just got to keep it rational. And the story of Atlantis, just like the phrase or the acronym UFO, has been so stigmatized by Hollywood that people think UFO equals spaceships and aliens, just like Atlantis equals Zacharias Sitchin ideas, like advanced civilization. Yeah, not Zacharias Sitchin. The psychic guy. What's his name? Edgar Cayce.
Cayce.
His ideas influence Hollywood so much. So Edgar Cayce made outlandish claims on Atlantis, and it just doesn't make logical sense. And then you get these 18th century writers. They're just confused. They're not really reading Plato in detail, and at the same time, they don't really care. Madame Blavatsky didn't really care to know the historicity of Atlantis. She wanted to make it into something more of a concept that's so much larger. And and the problem is she's violating something called the historian's fallacy. She's making the story bigger than it really is. And we can go on to I'll kind of explain some of these other slides. But yeah, I always wonder, where did you guys ever, or where do you think Atlantis was? Like, what is your perception?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I've always just, like I said, I remember the first time I heard of Atlantis was literally from a Choose Your Own Adventure book. Do you remember those?
Yes.
And it's essentially like you just read through the book and you get to like a part and it says, which turn to this page if you want to do this and turn to this page if you want to do that. And it was about that. And it just seemed like a fantastical idea. I don't have a formal opinion. I'm interested in the wrist shot structure right now, just because that's getting a lot of attention. I'd like to know what you think of the wrist shot structure, but really I don't have a formal opinion.
Same here. Yeah. I'm fairly familiar with the commonly hypothesized locations. I don't have a strong stake to claim for any of those. However, I'm intensely interested in all of it as a topic.
Yeah, and the popular stuff, it violates so many basic methodological things you learn in college. And that's why you can't fall for the popular stuff, but people just kind of fall for things like pareidolia. Well, it looks circular, so I guess that's Atlantis. but you're kind of forgetting some other details. But I do have to give credit to Jimmy from Bright Insight to putting it back in Africa, but it's not his idea. It was some Spanish group in Spain that proposed it back in Africa because of certain other researchers that I have found that existed before us. So when it comes to like the historian's fallacy, this is where Jimmy is trying to make the story sound bigger than it is. Like Atlantis was as powerful as Rome. It was not. But he's right to put it back in North Africa because the phrase Pillars of Hercules was associated to Straits of Gibraltar, but there's more than one Pillars of Hercules. But it wasn't the Pillars of Hercules wasn't associated to Gibraltar until the Roman period, but not during Homer and Solon's period. So people forget that. So people think, oh, the Pillars of Hercules is just the Straits of Gibraltar, but no, that's more of a modern interpretation because place names are moving as people are expanding their power and discovering new lands. Just like Atlanta, Georgia is named after the word Atlantis, doesn't mean it's Atlantis.
Well, and
or
just
Memphis,
like there's
Tennessee.
So many multiple cities with the same name across states in the U.S. People went further out and said, let's make another city with the same old name.
Jackson.
That's basically all that's going on. Yeah. Sorry, Dave, you were saying?
No, I just was naming, and like there's a million Jacksons, right? Like so there's a Jackson in every single state, probably.
Yeah, that's that's basically the same cross-pollination phenomenon that's happening with the Greeks. The Greeks are and the Phoenicians. They're just moving the place names farther west as they're discovering it. But it is true. Definitely, the context of the use of the word Atlas and Atlantis is definitely associated mainly to North Africa. But we're forgetting that. Let me just kind of follow my slides here a little bit. Go back. There we go. Like this map right here. Some people will interpret like, oh, look at under Africa. Was there a big sea, across, and that's Antarctica? No, it's just this cartographer just didn't know all the details. But there was a tradition because of the Muslims, map makers and cartographers. They understood that there was another river, and this river in Africa was the Niger. So the Muslims were probably one of the first to discover the Niger River, and the Muslims thought that the Niger River connected with the Nile. So they didn't know if they were connected. So by the time the Middle Ages come around, this is a 16th century map, 1649, and this cartographer just kept to that tradition. Like, okay, well, they're from the Middle East, so they should know the geography. So let's assume that the Niger River is just cuts across Africa and connects to the Nile. So that's why. So the Niger was originally called Nilus, Atlante, Profruit, whatever the Latin. I can't see it from here, but in I think it's Latin. So they called the Nile Atlante. So there was a tradition to calling the Egyptian area Atlante, and the Ethiopian area by the Romans Atlantia, and another place called Atlas, like Atlas, and Atlas is in like near land of Punt, that region of near Ethiopia. It was a port area. So those place names do give us a lot of clues to say it has something to do with Africa, but we have to be careful not to appeal to other studies that have nothing to really do with Plato, like learning about Ice Age studies. And Plato, he mentions elephants, he didn't say mammoths, okay? But they didn't know what a mammoth was. If they saw one, they probably would call it an elephant. It would have been the same name. But no, it's just way out of the context of the history. But the problem is there's this sola scriptura attitude that Graham and Randall have, that like it has to be 9,000 years before Solon. It doesn't make sense because Plato has stated that the Hellenes existed. Well, who are the Hellenes? The Proto-Greeks. They were the Mycenaeans. And we have dates on the Mycenaeans. So 900, most academics would say we need to change the date from 9,000 to 900 because there's some mistranslation going on by either the British translators or the monks at the time just got something wrong. Maybe they were reading the character for Mycenaean, character Greek for 100 versus 1,000. Some hypothesize that. So that's why we can go on to the next slide. But So, and we have to keep, in mind the law of proximity. So basically, the way we determine is like, how fast can a boat go? When were these boats carbon dated? Where are they? And the majority of these boats they found are all in the Eastern Mediterranean. By the time the Phoenicians come around, of course, they expand. But we can kind of figure this out by just the technology development of boats technology. How far can they travel within a day? Things like that. They only go 4 to 6 knots, these sailboats. So they're not going to expand way out to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean at the Azores and go all the way to North America. I mean, sure, some may have ended up stranded in Central America and got stuck there. Sure, that's a possibility. But it's not a continuous trade network. And Plato's pretty clear that he's keeping things within the context of the Persian world order.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
We can go on next slide. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about something
Sure.
quickly about on the first slide. It mentioned misinterpreting old maps. I don't know if that's the exact word. What is so your Grams and your Randalls like to use the Piri-Reis map. What do you think about that? What's your interpretation of the Piri-Reis map?
Yeah, I wouldn't take that map too seriously. Sure, we have dates on those maps, and they're like 14th century. And yes, they're the problem is on these maps, sometimes they blow up a landmass larger than another, like a bubble diagram.
We do that right now on our
projections,
map.
whether it's cylindrical, conical, or
Puerto Rico is not Atlantis. It was blown up large, and they thought that was like Atlantis, and it was rotated a different way. But we also have, and even remember, the Middle Ages are getting some of these map ideas from the early Ottomans, and the Ottomans. Not the Ottomans, but the Muslims in general, they were the first to really start to map out Africa before the Europeans. And there's a chance they may have ended up in South America. Not the Muslims, but maybe the African rulers that adopted Islam may have sent boats out to South America. And it could have been a one-way trip, maybe one time. There are some legends about that. Timbuktu, I think, that location. So they think that maybe they sent out. So some of these maps might be a little bit older. There's a possibility, but not hundreds of years older.
The Piri-Reis map seems to show Antarctica. How do you explain that?
I think that could just be a coincidence where they're just assuming there would be a landmass down there. But they're also probably conflating that potentially with Australia.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because is that missing? Is that missing on the Piri-Reis map? I can't remember.
I've heard that there's a chance that it's trying to record Australia. I think so. Don't quote me on that, but
if they were mapping Africa, it's not so far of a stretch to go from South Africa to Antarctica. Really, it's not that.
Yeah, it's not that. Yeah, it's a possibility they found Antarctica or they found some islands, and they knew that they just assumed there might be a landmass there. Because they also do that at the North Pole. They put a landmass on the north and in the south. Some maps, but that's just the map maker's interpretation of what he's reading and looking at other maps from the libraries in Medina as-Salam. So in Baghdad, this was a round city. So kind of getting back to Atlantis, when Plato speaks about round cities, we have historical precedents for this. And it goes back to the Persians, at least. And it's possible there are round city-states like the city-state of Mari in Syria, which was over 2000 BC. And what's strange is Plato seems to reference that, the Paradise Island, which I hypothesize is simply Egypt, there was a city-state there. So Plato's giving 3 scales. He's saying that there's a continent, there's an island paradise, or oasis is another term, and then there's the city-state. Well, the round city-state, we know where Plato's getting this idea from. He's getting it from Herodotus. He's getting it from the travels to Ecbatana and this city right here, Darabagerd, which dates to at least 500 BC. And there's another city called Gore. So these were definitely round cities. The Persians were emulating something to emphasize that we are kind of like the connection between heaven and earth and all that. But yeah, it was a palace city-state, but it's not gigantic. And there's researchers that found that the translations of Plato's dimensions are definitely off. You can't take those too literal because of being lost in translation. Yep. Plato was probably describing something more like this city-state in Iran called Darabagerd, and there's another one called Gore. And I have a link to some high definition satellites there, but you don't have to click on that. But check those out, and you'll see that if this city state, is eroded this badly and within 500 BC, is there a possibility there was a round city state under Cairo, Egypt, where the capital of Heliopolis would have been? Sure.
Mike, can you grab that link, Mike? Sorry to interrupt. Can you grab that link that he has it there? I want to look at it later. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it's right there.
I just can't get it. He can. He's got it.
Oh, that's right.
I'm gonna bookmark it.
I can't either.
Yeah. Bookmark it.
Yeah. You guys can have the link to my slides and take a look.
Thank
it's pretty
you.
interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
So so we have to keep in mind, which empires. Plato's talking about something that's so advanced. Okay, well, which civilizations were the most advanced? It's a process of elimination. You got the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and the Hittites. And which one was the one that had, as Plato called it, monstrous architecture, or some phrase like that? He calls it a monstrous form of the Temple of Poseidon. And he says it has 4 sides. It makes me wonder he's winking to the pyramids. But sure. Plato talks in a way where he's trying to make it kind of a mystery to his audience, because his audience, 80% of his audience probably never been to Egypt. So he's telling the exploration within the philosophical context of Herodotus and Solon. And he's presenting it, in an amphitheater. And he's like, oh, look at this amazing civilization. And then at the very end, people kind of figure out, oh, you're talking about Egypt. Oh, okay. So, so the round city motif definitely is inspired by Persia. Is there a chance there was one in Egypt? There might have been, but most Egyptian cities were rectangular, but maybe at the capital, there was one. And we have to keep in mind, the Bronze Age collapse, what caused that? That could be Santorini eruption. Plato mentions about advanced architecture. He says there are chariots. So, we're not talking about spaceships and fancy technology. Yeah. And then we have to keep in mind the population. Which regions had the largest population at the time, largest, densest population? At 2000 BC, it was Egypt. So that has a major geopolitical effect on the Mediterranean world.
Yeah, that's when we were talking when we first started talking on X. You mentioned getting into geopolitics was kind of how what's led you down this road to figuring out, making this connection.
Yeah, so in this slide, Rando keeps looking, to the Azores, but Plato's saying we're talking about an empire. Okay, there's no empire in the Azores. There's no megalithic obelisks that are 1,000 tons. Okay, but there is in Egypt. So the phrase, Pillars of Hercules. Well, I wonder what originally inspired that. Well, if you're the Greeks at 700 BC, and you land in Egypt, and you see a giant, 1,000-ton obelisk standing up, you're going to be like, damn, that's a pillar of the Titans.
Yeah.
So they're taking that motif and then reapplying it to their architecture as they learn about architecture from Egypt and making temples on top of mountains and then applying that. So in the geopolitical context, I should follow my slides here. We have to keep in mind, it's not just enough to read Plato's Critias and Timaeus. We should also read the Republic. If we see the context of the Republic, now Atlantis makes sense because he mentions a futuristic city-state of Greece that would be called Callipolis. And Callipolis represents the new city-state, the new rulership of the world. And Atlantis represents the old world. So, and he also has a political bias against the Persians. So he's taking this story of Atlantis, which is a reference of history rhyming with the Hittites, or with the Persians. But the reference to the wars, Plato said there was a war, and then all of a sudden, big destruction, war stops. And that war is probably Homer's Trojan War. And those are called the Hittite rebellions or the Asur rebellions of the Hittites. So those wars happened within Turkey. So Turkey is part of Atlantis, the continent. So anything that wasn't Europe was Atlantis. But the island is very specific to referencing an island in a continent that faces the sea. Plato says it faces the sea. There are mountains on either side. It's elongated, and the mountains aren't very high. So I'm like, okay. So I look at some other researchers, and Ulf Richter, a German guy, he says, well, that sounds like he's describing a delta oasis or a valley. Okay, so it starts to become clear that Plato's taking motifs and descriptions from Egypt and fitting it to his larger geopolitical message about Atlantis and reapplying, because the Trojan War was a big deal to the Greeks, and there was more than one. It wasn't just the Trojans. It could have been all along the coast of the eastern or western Turkey with the Mycenaeans. So he's bringing about the Mycenaean War with the Hittites, and it's not the Egyptians are the Atlanteans too, but Plato doesn't necessarily say that it was the Egyptians that were the ones invading Greece. It was the Hittites, because the Hittites were expanding down to Egypt, and they were expanding also to the west coast of Turkey. So they were in conflict with the Mycenaeans in Egypt. So Plato's taking Atlantis for a geopolitical message against the Persians, because he wants to make an alliance. He wants to emphasize we need to make an alliance with the Egyptians against the Persians. So he's taking the Hittite wars. Now, he didn't know the word Hittite at the time. I'm sure they called him many other names.
Right.
But he's taking Homer's story of the Trojan War, which is the Atlantean War, and applying that to the future with the Persians, against the Persians. So, yeah. I don't know if you guys have any other questions, but yeah, that's...
I just want to point out some viewers in our audience may be a little less well-versed in theories of Atlantis. Like earlier I said, I'm familiar with the popular theories. Atlantis itself is not a popular topic, so let's get some context here. Some people say that Atlantis was literally a continent that sunk into the Atlantic Ocean due to some, impact event or some geophysical event. What you're positing, Peter, is that we need to reinterpret our understanding of the area around the Mediterranean Sea and see that these people were talking about the old way that the land was understood and the old cultures that existed in the past. Is that somewhat accurate to say from a zoomed out perspective?
Yeah, because originally the Mediterranean Sea wasn't called the Mediterranean at 800 BC.
Right.
To some Greeks, it was called the Atlantic Sea or Atlantic Pelagos. Now, the Pelagos is referring to a smaller sea. So the priest of Sias, who speaks in the story of Timaeus, he's saying that, you Greeks are from this little sea and we are from the big sea. And when he says the big sea, he's saying your little sea is like a pond. He's just kind of exaggerating poetically, kind of sarcastically to the Greeks. He's talking about the Mediterranean. So the priest of Sias is sort of talking in the third person. So people, if they don't see that, but the priest of Sias also states that, yes, the Atlanteans, the other Atlanteans, which were the Hittites, were also invading Egypt. And that's a reference to the Battle of Kadesh in the Exodus as well. So the priest of Sias is aware of the geopolitical context that the Hittites were expanding. And the Hittites were basically born from the Assyrians and the Egyptians. They were basically at 1000 BC to the Mycenaeans, the Hittites and the Egyptians were kind of basically the same. They didn't really distinguish. They just knew that you're on the other side of the sea, you're a different kind of world, and we're different. So there's Pelagos, and there's other Greek names like Pontos that reference different types of seas. So Plato's translation, according to George Sorantites, he says that it's the Atlantic Pelagos is where the war happened, and that Plato referenced that there are 1,200 ships. Okay, well, which civilizations could make that many ships? Or maybe that was the total between the war, or so it could have been half that for the Mycenaeans versus the Hittites. But yeah, it's when he says about the war, it's most likely a reference to the Trojan Wars of the Hittites. Okay. Not Egypt wasn't the aggressor. So that's what's so confusing for people, because they're thinking, well, the Atlanteans are the island. The reference to the island is also where the Atlanteans expanded. Well, yeah, sort of. If you count that Egypt was expanding into the Palestinian region, and certain legends of Sisystraces, for example, believe that the Egyptians may have went all the way up to Turkey, and that's where the Egyptian propaganda might be saying, oh, those Hittites, they were born from us. So there's some propaganda you have to consider.
I think we always have to consider propaganda when we're dealing with humans, right?
Even in the past.
Even in the past. Existed. I wanted to ask Peter, we're talking about the Greeks, and so I wanted to ask about, do you know much about Herodotus and the maps they attribute to him, and how he says they depict the concentric circles and that kind of thing, and like circular structure in West Africa? What is your interpretation of that?
Well, if you're referring to the Rikat structure, no,
Yeah.
Herodotus never explored West Africa. He stayed in Iran and Jerusalem and Egypt. That's where he stayed mainly. And he was visiting the round cities of the Persian Empire. They were concerned about the Persians. The Persians were the big superpower, and they controlled the roads, they controlled the choke points, and they were expanding to the Greek lands. So that's why Herodotus was trying to learn about the Persians for geopolitical reasons and to map out things. But no, the reference to round cities is definitely a reference to the round cities of the Middle East. The oldest we have so far that survived is in Mari, Syria. It's 2,800 BC, something like that. And it's about 1 mile in diameter. But this tradition of the round city seemed to linger on for a long time. It was basically the prototype for the idea of a castle moat system. And there's a possibility Egypt may have had one, but if it's under Cairo, it's long gone. It's sunken. So going back to geography a little bit, when it comes to the Rikat structure, George Sarantites, that researcher in the latest documentary Atlantis Puzzle, which I highly recommend, I don't agree with.
What's it called?
Atlantis Puzzle by George. Well, George Sarantites is the main researcher guest. Jack Kelly is the director, and Jack Kelly did a good job. But they got too literal. They were so fixated that maybe the date is still 9,000 years before, so on. It doesn't fit with the other context, though. So they did keep to the Rikat structure just because it was popular and everyone's talking about it. So they just kind of defaulted to say the Rikat. But George Sarantites is one of the first to figure out that, yes, it has something to do with North Africa, that the Pillars of Hercules was not associated to Gibraltar until the Romans. So it was moved over time. That's basically his main research. So there were 2 C's, there are 3 C's actually. So we had to figure out what Plato was referring to. And you also have to look at the map upside down.
Right. Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah.
Jimmy addresses that a little bit, but he kind of avoids it.
Yeah, there's some details Jimmy leaves out. Like, he gets so literal, like an island. Sure, but the Rikat is not an island. Well, he was just like, well, maybe it was a giant flood that covered all of North Africa. Yeah, if we're talking about 2 million years ago, sure, maybe, but not recently in the past since the Younger Dryas. No, it was dry. It was arid.
That's another big difference to make. I don't think anyone disagrees that continents can rise and sink, but that happens over millions of years. That would take a really long time for that to be Atlantis. And your whole 9,000 versus 900 thing puts us well out of the realm of continental drift. We're in much shorter time periods.
Sure.
And Plato says specifically, the island of Atlantis faces the sea. And Ulf Richter of Schwabenheim, Germany, a researcher there, this was the English translation of his research, but he argued that the plain of Atlantis, he figured out the translations to cubits and figured out the plain of Atlantis is about the size of Egypt's Nile Delta and the valley. And he says that the sea, this island, we get conflated with the phrase oasis. It's because there's a sea of sand around Egypt. The main part of Egypt is the Nile Valley. So Plato, when he says island in the English translation, we get confused because we think island refers to a literal island in the ocean. But no, Plato said it faces the sea, and it's an island agricultural plain. He says it's an elongated oblong shape. So I think he's referencing the valley, but he also says in some translations they also say it also has more of a triangular or round shape near the sea. So yeah, it's a reference to a delta the whole time because the delta was a paradise back in those days. So in the reference to within and outside the pillars. So the priest Isaiah said within the pillars. So he's talking about the Hittites. He's not talking about the Egyptians. But he also says they tried to subdue us outside the pillars. So the outside the pillars was the pillars of the Aegean Sea, Pelagos, which derives from the word archipelago. But yeah, so there's other details we could see, but we could go, oh wait, I can't control it. We go next slide.
Yep. One thing I'm picking up a theme here of your presentation is the idea of conflation, not just with the size of certain structures, but conflation of time, the 900 versus 9,000, conflation
Dimensions.
of dimensions, abilities of these like technological abilities as well. And it's hard. We do have to consider that we project our own ideas and our own knowledge onto what the past, what the past is doing,
that's because of, Hollywood did not help. And I'm going to blame academics too. Okay. Academics should be able to figure this shit out. This is not complicated. People just need to freaking read Plato. Okay. He literally says there are elephants in the land. He says there are the most ferocious animal in the land. What could that be? I don't know. The hippo, the lion, the crocodile, name your animal. Oh, it clearly is not reference to animals in Europe.
Now I know why you and Rebirth are friends.
And so all these details literally Plato has. Even within the English translation, he's like 90% correct in the English translation. It's just those dimensions and those numbers are off, and some of the translations like island versus oasis. He says, this is a big clue. He mentions a bunch of plants, and one of the plants he says is dates. Well, we know where dates grow. We have botanists that figure all the locations of how plants spread over time. But he said Atlantis does not have the coconut. That's such an interesting detail, because how did the Greeks know about the coconut at 300 or 400 BC? Well, that's because Herodotus traveled to Persia, and the Persians were interacting with the Indus Valley and India.
Further,
So the Persians were taking plants from India and Indus Valley for their gardens to plant for Darius the first and second. So they were really into paradise building gardens. And so the fact that Plato mentions the coconut, not the coconut, means that we have to look back to the east, not the west, because there's no coconuts on the Azores. Okay, now there might be, because people transplant them. But there are no coconuts in the region of the Atlas mountain range. The word Atlas also gives us a clue that's related to Africa. So that detail is so clear. Another detail he says about the kingdom of Atlantis, he says there are 12 kingdoms, but there's one main capital, and these kingdoms are not allowed to war with each other. Well, if you study the geopolitics of ancient Egypt, you learn that Egypt also has these things called nomes or nomarchs. And each ruler had a region, like a governor, sort of, or a governor region. And they were basically like kings within those regions. But they had to adhere to the authority of the pharaoh who controlled the army. So it was like an alliance system. It was a confederation. It was like the United States. You got states, and then you got the federal state. So that's what Plato was referring to. Now, whether the number fluctuates in Egypt, obviously, depending over thousands of years, the kingdom shifted, or the governorship shifted. But this reference to these 12 kingdoms, and that there's a central power at the capital of Atlantis near the sea. So that near the delta region. And he says there were multiple rivers. Well, does Egypt have multiple rivers? Yes, in the delta as it branches out. He also says during the flood, there was a shoal of mud in the way. Well, Egypt is prone to liquefaction. He also says it doesn't rain, but it rains sometimes in the winter. Well, Egypt does get rain in the winter once every 3 years or so. It will get sometimes they call them metacanes or dragon storms. And it will flood. Cairo had a flood in 2020.
Last year. Yep.
I know 2020 was a big one they had. So it was like 6 inches in an hour or something like that. It was like crazy. But when they get rain, but then it kind of stops for 3 years. But Plato's reference that it rains in the winter is such an interesting detail, because that puts it back in northern Africa, where the Mediterranean is what's causing the rain regions. He also said, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, your Graham Hancocks and your Robert Shocks, they always say that, there is no rain on the Giza Plateau.
No, it rains.
Yeah.
Every 5 years on average. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's enough over a period of time, like a period of hundreds or even thousands of years, to cause erosion on some of those monuments. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's always being said that there's no rain, so there's no way that this stuff could have been caused the whole the Sphinx is older than the Younger Dryas theory kind of thing.
Did you hear about the flood that happened in Libya? Was it also in 2020? It was a metacane, and it killed 20,000 people. A flash flood just came down the mountain regions.
No, I had no idea.
And
Wow.
yeah, stuff like that can happen. So the chance of when Plato speaks about a flood, he's referring to Deucalion's deluge.
Mm-hmm.
So Atlantis story is a culmination of Plato's sources, which is Homer, Herodotus, Solon, and others. And he's just taking these other stories and reapplying it to his philosophical, geopolitical interpretation. But there is actually history in what Plato is saying. He says the reference that there's no coconuts. Okay, well, we know that means that Atlantis must be in the eastern region because the Persians knew about the coconuts who told the Greeks. And he says the extent of the island is greater than Libya and Asia combined. Now, people think, oh, the island's bigger than Asia? No, he's saying the extent, the elongation. So he's talking about a ribbon, like the Nile Valley. It extends so far south. He didn't know how far south. He didn't explore that southern Egypt. But he understood that this island paradise is like a ribbon that goes all the way south. And that's what he was referring to, the extent of Atlantis. But he's also referring to the continent, the scale at the continent level, which is simply North Africa and the Hittites, and basically anything that's the Middle East, was the Atlantean world. Other details, he says that there's no iron. So that gives us a date. We know when iron really started coming about. There's a chance there might have been iron smelting 3000 BC, but it was minute. It wasn't like swords and shields.
And if you had an iron sword back there, you're going to be king of the world.
The oldest smelting is in West Africa, and I think they've carbon dated that to 3000 BC of iron. And they were definitely folding the metal, and they were making probably spears more likely. So Africans were basically the Berber Africans, I would say, and the Ethiopians were the ones that went into Egypt. So that's why I reference this anime, Nadia's Secrets of Blue Water, which is Gainax Studios anime. And Gainax Studios, this anime is what inspired Disney's Atlantis. But Disney's Atlantis wanted to connect a Native American style, whereas Japan studio of Gainax, they wanted to connect it back to Africa because Hideki Anno, the director, he did his research and he realized there was some connection with Tartessos, some connection with Herodotus. He said, okay, we need to put Atlantis back in Africa. Now he put it in Lake Victoria. I don't think it was in Lake Victoria, but again, he was also inspired by Zacharias Sitchin and all that. But don't take movie directors too seriously. But sometimes they find some nuggets that we should look into and say, okay, so yeah, he basically said that the Atlanteans are basically, they were brown. They were not white. They were, they weren't even, I wouldn't say they were black either. I would say they were like Berber descent or maybe like Ethiopian Habesha style people that went up and established Nubia. So yeah, it was, of course, Egypt was a multicultural site because it was 3,000 years old or more. So yeah, basically you had the Atlanteans. This is what it's kind of throws a wrench into Robert Sepper's ideas because he wants to believe Atlanteans were white and not in Africa. But he's a white nationalist. I don't recommend him. And I'm a conservative saying that. So yeah.
Continent that disappeared, and where's that continent type of thing?
Well, yeah, it's not the continent. He said the island subsided in mud. That's what actually Plato is saying. It was sinking in the mud, and there was a flood. And we had to figure out, this is where climatology can tell us. But he also mentioned, another detail. He mentions there are 3 types of stone used in the architecture of Atlantis. He says there's black, white, and red. Gee, I wonder what that could be referring to. Well, what does Egypt has? It has black diorite, white limestone, white alabaster, and red rose granite. So
red pyramid.
Yeah, so it gets pretty clear, I think. But we can go to the next slide if you want.
There we go.
So we also need to consider cross-pollination. So this is where a lot of the New Agers don't want to connect Atlantis back to the Bible. But in reality, we have to start thinking about that. Authors have already figured out, like this author, Russell E. I can't see his last name, but this author connects the hypothesis that Plato, was the creation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, he's not, I don't believe that correctly, but he's correct to say that there was definitely some connection between the Middle East and Plato's reference of Atlantis and Deucalion's deluge.
Russell E. Gemerkin.
Yeah, I can never say his last name.
Yeah. I had to zoom in.
Yeah, this author, I think he's pretty much figured out that, Atlantis has something to do with the Middle East, and this fits within the law of proximity. You got to obey some certain methodologies to make this claim. And we know cross-pollination of cultures when it comes to mythologies was definitely a thing going on between Greece and Egypt. Like Zeus is referred to maybe Osiris, or there's this reference that, this god's referred to this god in Egypt, and there's that connection in that. So now there's this, we also can look to other legends within the Middle Eastern context, like the Islamic legends of Iram, Saba, and Ad. And these stories have similar themes. So we can take these themes and figure out what's their original inspiration. And it all goes back to the question, which I started hypothesizing because of other researchers. Is Plato's Atlantis just another version of Genesis, the Hebrews' Garden of Eden? And I bet it is. And this throws a wrench for the evangelicals. Evangelicals say Garden of Eden must be in Babylon. Well, again, there's cross-pollination of place names being shifted, and we have to start to question, what do we mean by paradise? What is a garden? So Plato says an island with agricultural plains and allotments. He's talking about the vegetation so much in the story of Atlantis. It's such an emphasis. And even the name Atlantis itself derives from the original word in Greek, Atlantos, which is conjugated from a Greek word for sand, which is amos. So he's literally saying the name Atlantis means a sea of sand. So the name of the etymology can tell us a little bit. Again, those names, the definitions can shift over time, so it may not be exactly precise, but we know Atlas or Atoll, it refers to sea. So that's why Plato referenced that basically this island paradise is, Egypt, an oasis in a sea of sand.
I'd never heard that interpretation down to the etymology before.
That's what I don't know Greek, but George Sarantites and J. Gwen Griffiths and J.G. Bennett and others, they know a little Greek. And these are the researchers we need to give credit. Okay, not me. Okay, if it wasn't for J. Gwen Griffiths, most historians would not take the story seriously. But J. Gwen Griffiths, he has an essay. It's only 25 pages, I think. And he is pretty concise. He's saying, okay, it's clearly a reference to the Persians here. Where are round cities? Well, we know Ecbatana was round. We know Susa was partially oval-shaped. We know about Darabagar and Gore. He's saying it's something to do with Persia. So why is Plato referencing Atlantis if it's older, if it's 900 years before Solon? What destructive event could have triggered this story? I think we all know what the answer to that is. It's the Santorini eruption. We go back to that slide. So J.G. Bennett, he's an academic, he's an author too. He figured this out. He says, okay, Santorini must be the catalyst for Plato's Atlantis. So because even the priests of Science, if you read carefully in Plato's story, he's saying the destruction happened in the homeland of the Greeks. But it affected everything. It affected Egypt too. So the reference to the Exodus, the sea people. So those are the Mycenaeans, and also people leaving Egypt, the Hyksos Jews. They left Egypt as the sea people, Mycenaeans, were coming in and establishing the Philistines. So they're figuring, all these researchers are kind of figuring out. So J.G. Bennett gets credit for connecting the Exodus and Atlantis to Santorini. Ulf Richter from Germany, he focuses on the dimensions of Atlantis and the mistranslations and the typology descriptions. And J. Gwen Griffiths focuses on the historical context, and he's one of the first Egyptologists to see the connection back to Santorini and the Bible. He literally is referencing, it seems to go back to the Hebrews, reference to a garden paradise. And then George Sarantites figured out that the translations for sea and ocean are incorrect. The Pillars of Hercules have been shifted. But George Sarantites, he kind of defaulted to the recap because he probably isn't aware of these other researchers. But, I think he's shifted kind of back to where, I think Atlantis might be, Eastern Mediterranean. But his latest documentary, it's still pretty good. I recommend it. They just defaulted to Rick Cat, but no, I don't believe it's the Rick Cat because it's just too large. Okay, to be a city state. Okay, it's like the size of London, and if you go on the ground, you actually look at the topography. It makes no sense. You can't build on that. It's bedrock unless you blast your way through, and it's bedrock, so it's not covered. So where are the megaliths? Where's the obelisks? Where are the temples? Where are the pyramids? Whatever. Where's the granite? Where's all this stuff Plato talks about? Sure, Jimmy's correct about elephants, okay, because Africa has elephants, but how did the Greeks learn about elephants? From the Egyptians.
Yeah.
So I recommend these researchers. I have their essays on my channel. I have used AI and typed it up or copy paste of their essays and then try to recreate their voice. Most of these guys are dead. 3 of them are dead. George Cervantes is still alive. And I brought their words to life on my channel just for my own research too, because I might write a paper someday. And I highly recommend listening to their essays. And when you research things, you can't just say, "Oh, George Cervantes is right. Oh, J. Griffith is right." Take every one of their research and piece it together. And what's the final conclusion? Well, it all seems to go back to Egypt because Plato literally says Egypt. He says it extends to the region of Egypt, from Libya to Egypt. Now, Egypt wasn't necessarily a reference to the island paradise of Egypt. That's what we call it. It was just a general region to represent the south or northeast region of Africa. So Plato says it extends to Egypt, but he says there's an island there.
That's a really good point you made about not dismissing any one of these guys because you found one thing that you think they're wrong about, you disagree with, and also not taking all of them at wholesale saying, I found the guy that's right about everything. It's a piecemeal function. Yeah,
if you take off Richter, like he says, okay, Atlantis can't be 10 miles or 30 miles in diameter. What's going on? So he figured out some other translational errors, and he realized, okay, now 4 miles is reasonable. We can fit 4 miles at Heliopolis, potentially. Now, do we know if there was a lost city state under Heliopolis? Well, you got a giant city on top of it, so good luck finding it. And it's probably been completely destroyed. If Plato's correct that there was a massive flood that happened, where did floods happen? Well, they happen in rivers. So let's start at rivers, not in the middle of the Rick-Cat structure where there's no monsoons that go there. So that's where it makes the climatology doesn't fit.
Yeah, the stuff that Jimmy, Randall, Graham, etc. typically they use the Younger Dryas impact theory to explain that, and they say that this civilization that was Atlantis existed before that and was wiped out by this major global cataclysm. You don't buy that?
Why don't they pick the older Dryas or the Bowling Alloy period? They specifically pick the Younger Dryas, but the older Dryas is just as sharp, or the Bowling Alloy. So, but no, these blips are just ice age phenomenons that happen because of the Earth's eccentricity.
Sure.
Oh yeah.
Swapping tabs real quick because I just happen to have this paleo climatology slide pulled up in another tab. The Bowling Alloy period that Peter's describing is this almost 13,000 years ago when the ice age ended abruptly or started to end. It was basically as warm as it is today, which happened very rapidly, and then also rapidly went right back to ice age conditions for a couple thousand years before warming a second time. So all of this was very tumultuous.
Yeah. But you can see it took time to get down there. It wasn't just a one instant thing. And also, you have to extend that graph out a little farther out. If you extend that time, you see that there's more than one Bowling Alloy period.
Of stuff.
Oh yeah,
that matches this pattern. But the pattern stops at the Holocene. So this pattern is just a normal ice age pattern due to probably maybe something hit the north. Greenland, but they found the Hiawatha crater, but that's dated to like 30 to 50 million years. You could put a 10 million year margin of error, and it still would not fit for Atlantis. And asteroids do not cause these massive blips unless you're talking like the dinosaur asteroid. Okay, we'll all be dead. So most of these
not rebooting in 2,000 years after one of those.
Yeah. So like these are large, Earth movements that are happening. The Earth moving away from the sun or tilting, and all these complicated, geophysical things. That's what this pattern most likely is. Even Matt from Ancient Architects doesn't fall for the Younger Dryas anymore, nor does History for Granite, a new channel that's pretty good, talks about pyramids. He's not going to fall for this stuff. So if it's not the Younger Dryas, well, the only recent major geological event that in the ancient times was the Santorini eruption, and people don't realize that Castle Bravo, that nuclear bomb, was 15 megatons. Santorini was 2,000. So I think it would have had an effect on history.
Yep.
And it would have inspired the great flood story of the Bible, the destruction of the Garden of Eden. And Ralph Ellis is one of the first authors, as well as Gary Greensburg, to figure it out that the Garden of Eden is probably a simple reference to the plain of Egypt, the agricultural oasis. And this delta would have been larger during the Ice Age because they had that black soil, whereas Tigris and Euphrates did not have that lush soil. It was more sandy mixed silt. But Egypt had that volcanic silt. So that's why so that's why it's hypothesized that Egypt is probably the original inspiration for the Garden of Eden, because there are maps from the 14th century that show that the Gihon was a reference to the Nile, and that the Pishon was a reference, I have these maps here actually show it, was a reference to a branch of the Nile that connects to what they call the Canal of the Pharaohs, which was a very strategically important canal in ancient times. So these, as the Bible says, a river went out of Eden and then parted into a head. But for some reason, evangelical Christians especially, they have kind of twisted this up, and they say, no, it's actually referring to the watershed is coming down and then formed into one river. I'm like, you're telling me that ancient people could perceive the size and scale of a watershed? I don't think the Hebrews would be able to perceive that scale because they didn't have big maps, they didn't have satellites, but they could probably perceive that the Nile splits into a head like a snake. And which civilization used a snake as a crown? It wasn't the Babylonians, it was the Egyptians. So, and we know historically that the early Hyksos Egyptian Jews, I guess you could say, at 1400 BC or 600 BC, 1600 BC, they came out of Egypt. And most of these biblical stories are rewritten around the year that King David and King Solomon come around, and that's when this stuff is getting written down, like, hundreds of years after. So these stories are definitely talking about a real great flood. So the banishment out of the Garden of Eden in the beginning of Genesis is just a simplistic version of the larger story of the Exodus. They call it the documentary hypothesis. It's just, first you have a simplistic version, and then it expands as time goes on. But people think these are kind of like supposed to be very chronological stories, but they're not. They're all fragmented stories. And they got put together by King Solomon or David. He ordered them to create, papyrus scrolls about these stories to create some new identity for the early Hebrews. And they wanted to break away from Egypt. So they had a negative animosity. So when they referenced the nakedness in the garden, well, yeah, because the Egyptians dressed more seductively. They were sexier, okay? And they didn't have to wear robes to block them from the sun because there was more shade in Egypt. There were more trees, plants. So they dressed differently. So, but by the time the Jews left Egypt, 500 years later, they lived in the region of Haifa, in that region, and it was a little more arid. They had to protect themselves and became more patriarchal. So their attitudes on sexuality changed. So that's kind of a reference there. But yeah, if there was a Garden of Eden, Egypt is the most fertile region in the Middle East, not counting the Indus Valley. Indus Valley, we could say that's like a Garden of Eden, but I would say that's more like Shambhala or Agartha. That's probably the inspiration for those legends, is that region.
That makes sense.
That does make sense.
So again, go ahead. If you have any questions.
No, I just wanted to comment that this Santorini is like less than 1,000 kilometers from both Cairo and from Alexandria. So that
Yeah.
kind of that adds up for me because
Rocked an
obviously an
entire-
eruption of that size would like cause geological and climate and like
It
all
causes
kinds of
floods.
issues. Yeah, and floods.
I
Yeah.
didn't know this, but apparently in the 1815th eruption in Indonesia, that they claim that that increased as it exploded. 2 or 3 years later, it would start dumping rain in atmospheric river events in certain regions of the Earth,
Yeah.
and causing flash flooding, like 6 inches in a day or 10 inches in a day potentially.
Yeah.
So there's a chance when you actually read Genesis and realize that it's connected to Plato's Atlantis, or Plato's Atlantis is connected for the inspiration of the Middle Eastern stories. Author Gary Greensberg said that I figured out the height of the flood, and he found it referenced in cubits, and he took those measurements. He said, okay, well, it said about 15 cubits of the waters rise to cover the foothills of the mountains. Okay, well, foothills of what mountains? But when he translated that, it was only about 25 to 50 feet. 50, I would say maximum 50 feet. So that's still a big flood. So they might be right about they would call that about like a 500 or 1,000 year flood event. So it is a rare flood. It doesn't happen that often, once every couple thousand years. And this flood may have been caused, first you have the Santorini eruption. It causes a tsunami that goes all the way down to Egypt. That tsunami would be potentially 30 to 50 feet, maybe 100 feet at most. It would flood the Nile Delta. And then 3 years later, you have another flood, and it floods, it causes monsoon events from India to come into Ethiopia, and they sometimes call them atmospheric rain events, like ones in California. So the volcano could just start on these patterns of jet streams. It will start dumping it once it just gets to a high capacity. I don't understand the physics of it exactly, but that's what I've read. And so, yeah, volcanoes can cause massive flood events in unusual places. So that's where Noah's Ark, the story of Noah's Ark. Well, which civilization had big boats that could move 1,000-ton obelisk? Well, it wasn't the Babylonians. Okay, they didn't have big boats.
It wasn't the Egyptians, though, was it?
It was definitely the Egyptians. They had massive boats. And these boats, the problem is the Romans took them all and the Persians took them all and probably destroyed them or reused them, wood.
Because there's no real, there's no boats found in Egypt, like massive boats, right? As far as I know, there's just there's a few crappy ones, but what boats are we talking about?
There's a lot of smaller ones they found because those are the majority. But the bigger ones are normally what they do is they combine the smaller ones, or sometimes they make them a little bigger, and they turn it into a barge. So they put planks on top of it and make it larger, and then it has a canopy sometimes. No, there is records to say that the Nemi ships, the treasure boats of Rome, were probably inspired by the boats of Egypt, and that they recreated these barge arcs, for pleasure reasons, and then it makes sense that the Noah story is a reference to some kind of, it doesn't mean that they're bringing elephants in and tigers. Okay, sure, one of two animals. Sure, they're talking about livestock. This is where the writers are saying, hey, futuristic people, use your brains. Okay,
Right.
We want to save our cattle because they're going to drown. We need milk. We need our goats, our donkeys, our horses. So yeah, they took these boats, more than likely that Egypt had, to use transport megaliths and to put animals on to get the hell out of Egypt and land in the region of Israel. That's probably where they landed. And the original Mount Ararat, obviously, I don't believe it's the modern day Ararat. Again, place names are moving, okay? Modern day Ararat's way too high. It doesn't make any sense. But there's another famous mountain in the Bible, and that's Mount Hermon. They would have seen Mount Hermon at the coastal regions of Haifa. And that's what they're referencing. It doesn't mean they literally mean it covered the whole damn mountain. No. It was the Garden of Eden that was flooded. Another thing that can tell us where the Garden of Eden Atlantis is the animals. So reference again, the Nadia character is my favorite character. So Atlantis and Egypt, Plato is talking about this paradise. And the Garden of Eden is just like that. They said there are, birds. There's reference to having dominion over the animals, the idea of naming the animals. Well, this could be a reference to domestication. So we have to look at this anthropologically. So the main route for bird migration goes right up to Egypt. The main civilization that domesticated animals first was in Egypt and Babylon to some extent, or Sumer. But Egypt had more plentiful wildlife. They even originally Egypt had a lot. There was a type of lion they had in a North African lion that was bigger than the sub-Saharan African lion. But the Egyptians, killed them off for sport, and also because they were dangerous. They were living in Egypt, so they killed them off. But so yeah, the reference to animals in the Bible and this paradise, it was a literal place. There's no other place in the world going back 3000 BC that was like this. And Egypt was more lush in the past. They recently discovered a second branch off the Nile that goes up to Giza, and this goes up into the delta. That could be the third river, the headwater.
We talked about that this summer. That's
great. Yeah. So that's an amazing discovery. And there's a chance that's what they mean by, there was a garden. It went out of the land of Cush and parted into a head. The Hebrews were simply trying to describe a delta. Okay, maybe they didn't quite have the understanding of that typology of a delta, but they knew it branched, and that was an important space. And they did not want to leave Egypt and wander in the land of Nod and Eden. Nod is like the desert regions, and Eden's also the desert region.
Yeah.
Because the Garden of Eden is not the name of the garden; it's a title. So the Garden of the Eden. Eden refers to uncontrolled lands, or wild lands, or deserts.
I wonder what Robert Schoch would say about the explanation of the Santorini eruption causing the floods that could potentially have caused the erosion on the Sphinx enclosure. Because
I think he would agree with that. I think there's a chance he would agree with it.
Well, are you going to Cosmic Summit this year? I don't know if that's a thing you do.
I don't really agree with 90% of what they talk about. I do like Robert Schoch. I actually used him once in one paper I did at college. At the time I cited him, and I think he's correct that yes, there's definitely erosion all over Egypt. But the problem is it's a fusion of sand, wind erosion, and water erosion. So it gets a little confusing what you're looking at. But there's definitely erosion on the Sphinx. But the Sphinx was covered up with limestone, so you might be. As they took all that off, it destabilizes it. And these massive rain events that Cairo does get once every 5 to 10 years on average, 6 inches of rain in a day. Yeah, it's going to, and if imagine extrapolate that out over hundreds of years.
Right.
Yeah, you're going to get erosion. Because Egypt, it does rain in Egypt. Because Plato says it. It says it rains in the winter times, once in a while.
I wonder the reason I asked about Cosmic Summit is because we're going, and I got to talk to Robert Schoch last time. I asked him a bit about the Yonaguni monument, so I'm going to ask him about this if I get to talk to him in person, just about, especially in particular, the cyclical rain. I mean, it's always put out there that it doesn't rain. It hasn't rained there in 7,000 years, or whatever they say, right?
It just rained in 2020.
Right.
It was
and also it's not like it's sprinkling, right? It's like raining a lot.
Egypt tends to have these like what they call dragon storms. That's what the meteorologists call them. We can go to the next. Actually, did I mention it here? Oh, I'm sorry. Metacanes and dragon storms. And these events are little typhoons, basically, or hurricanes in the Mediterranean. And they will flood the northern regions. Sure. Now, this gets into, since we're talking about Atlantis, Plato does mention the reference to gods. Okay, he did believe that there was supernatural realm. So this is where I disagree with Rebirth when he said that demons is just a reference to a wise man. He's correct in the philosophical. Yeah, he's correct in the philosophical context that Plato was using that. But there's another word called daimonia. Like demonic, daimonia, and angulus. So Plato knows about this other word, angulus, and daimonia, which is also a reference to a spirit. So a daimon is someone who is shining and bright, like the UAPs, like the UFOs. Wonder where the Greeks get that idea from? Probably from the Egyptians. And so, yeah, there is a religious context we also have to consider in Plato's writings, and we need to figure out where is he getting this religious context. Well, we know what the priest Caius said. He said, you Greeks just made all your mythologies, they're nothing but children's stories. You just made all that up by taking our stories. That's basically what the priest of Sais was saying when he was talking to Solon, assuming that translation is pretty accurate. He was saying that you Greeks are like children, but you're honorable children, and you were born from us, the Egyptians.
Yep.
And that's a reference probably to the Minoans. So the Minoans traded a lot with Egypt, not so much with the Mycenaeans until later. The Minoans had more cultural similarity with Egypt than European Celtic cultures. So they were basically, there's a chance that the Minoans could have been an Egyptian colony, not a trading port, I guess you could say. And then they became their own culture over time, over hundreds of years. So that's where Plato's reference to the gods, and then Zeus, he ends the story saying the god of gods spoke and it ended. Like once the gods spoke, boom, an explosion happened, and all you warlike men, both sides of the war, sank into the sea. And then this connects to the Bronze Age collapse. The question is, these dates might be off, so I am open to the possibility that I think archaeologists have gotten a lot of these dates off by a few hundred years.
I think that's probably the case in most cases. when you're going back thousands of years, it's like, it's hard.
It starts, the farther time you go, the larger the margin of error starts to get.
Right.
So this
sorry,
is UFO stuff, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to kind of ask about. So, so being a Catholic, what do you know about the modern Catholicism and the Vatican stance on stuff like Bigfoot, Greys, orbs, UFOs? Like, what do you know? Or
I don't think they've released any. Diana Pasoka hasn't mentioned if the Vatican has declared that Bigfoots are real. Like, no,
Sure.
But I think they have a general consensus that, okay, if you have a big furry hominid with red eyes staring at you from your backyard, that's probably a fucking demon. Okay, let's use some common sense here, okay, and not say, oh, I'm gonna get closer to it. No, they understood this because they're learning it from the Muslims. The Muslims have also had stories like this. They have different cryptids, though. Our cryptids tend to be Bigfoot, Greys, and dogmen or werewolves. But in the Islamic world, they're a little bit different. In Japan, they're also different. So but they all connected to a certain type of spirit. In Japan, they call them yokais, Islam jinn, or fairies in England. So Jacques Vallée is one of the first to really kind of piece this together. And Diana Pasoka is kind of concluding that, yes, the Catholics basically agree with Jacques Vallée on this, that yes, that these angels have the power to conjure up avatar bodies, and the Hindus speak about this. So the Hindus say, yes, the original word for avatar was a god taking a physical form, literally. So this reference to sea serpents, when Lou Elizondo started winking to this idea of sailors' stories, I'm like, oh Lord, please don't mention sea serpents. He was close, but then he stopped himself short, because this is very disturbing, because there are definitely records in the 17th century, 1800s, in Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and in Japan, of actual captain logs saying they literally saw a sea serpent with a head, and it was relatively big, like the size of the boat, the length of a boat, average ship at the time, and it had glowing red eyes. There's a case in Florida, in the Panhandle of Florida, these boys going out, and they claim this mist came in and they got stranded at sea. They were trying to go to explore some World War II ship. And then one of the boys died and got killed by a sea serpent. And the other boys testified that this happened. This was in the 80s, I believe, or no, I'm sorry, 70s or 80s, I think. So there's some weird stories that the FBI is keeping wraps on. And yeah, the possibility is very disturbing. I sure hope this isn't a reality, but I would not rule it out, because we think the laws of physics are orderly and all that. But after what I've personally have seen, I understand that no, there's definitely something supernatural out there, and these are probably the gods that the Egyptians speak about. but they're just different artistic forms and different terminologies. But it's not like these things are evolutionary creatures. I believe in evolution 100%. Okay. But these entities, these UAPs, somehow have the power to transform from metallic plasma, solid metal, and then solidify or then de-densify themselves, I guess, into an aura state. This aura can shapeshift in electromagnetic spectrum, and somehow they can conjure up a physical body. There's one video I found, I posted for the channel Suspect Sky. He's a UFO YouTuber. And this woman from Detroit, she looked like she was high, she was smoking, African-American woman, didn't look like she got everything together. But I took her seriously because she had video evidence. She didn't look like a person who was just trying to make money, fake things. And she put her camera out, and she saw something that looked like a leg of a werewolf was forming, and then it fizzed out of existence. She saw it step, and I zoomed into the video. I looked closely, like, yeah, that's pretty disturbing. So these things, there are demons, and there are definitely angels. Angels don't take hybrid, grotesque forms. They stay, I think, as balls of light most of the time, but they do have the same abilities. But not all angels are equal in their power. Some are more powerful than others.
That's typical in the structure of the Bible anyway, right?
Yeah, I think Rebirth called it Henonism, the belief that there's one big God, but there's multiple gods. So that's the scary reality for a lot of. So when UAP disclosure is fully disclosed, a lot of Muslims and evangelical Christians are going to have trouble with this. Okay, the reality that there are multiple gods, and they have abilities that can literally get inside your house if you give them permission. But they're not all powerful. But again, they're purely electromagnetic spirits, and you don't want them getting in your neurons. You do not want them getting in your brain. The famous case, is from St. Louis, The Exorcist. You know the movie The Exorcist? That was documented by police officers, by the diocese, eyewitnesses. Something freaky happened to a boy and his aunt, and they had to take him to the I think it was the Cathedral of Francis Xavier in near downtown St. Louis to get him exorcised. And it was a long process. It wasn't like the demon just went away after 2 hours after the movie's done. No, it took like months. And it was, it was trying to control the boy's body and trying to levitate it. And I have personally witnessed a jinn once, or a poltergeist, I guess you'd call it, at my school. And I literally saw with my friend in our classroom at night when we were doing some studying, our studio classroom, we saw a wooden balsa wood used for modeling, and it teleported. And I have a video about this. It's 30 minutes long. But yeah, it was physically teleporting the ball. So if Neil deGrasse Tyson saw that, he would lose his shit. Okay. He would not be able to handle it. I could barely handle it as a Catholic. Yeah, it's disturbing when you physically actually see this in reality. It's what's his name? Colonel Nell, was it, that spoke at the SALT? Yeah, he spoke at the SALT conference. He said something interesting. He said, "It's one thing to believe; it's another thing to know."
Yes.
Like you literally saw this.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, who's the latest whistleblower, so-called whistleblower, that came out from the News Nation?
The News Nation guy. Jake Barber. Yeah.
I
was literally going to ask you about that here in a minute.
Yeah, I'm aware of all that. Yeah, Jake Barber. If you listen closely to what Jake Barber is saying, he's winking to the spiritual realm. So why is he doing that? Why aren't we talking about aliens with spaceships? Because the video evidence that I have seen leaked out on Reddit from actual Air Force officers, more than likely, they're not supposed to be doing this, but I'm sure there are a few Air Force captains or lieutenants secretly leaking a few videos out on Reddit. And there's one video, you guys might have seen it, where some kind of missile projectile was shot at 3 metallic orbs, and the orbs shattered, but they reformed. You can't kill these things. I
haven't seen that. If you could send us that offline, that would be great. If you could find that. I wanted to know what you thought of the news, just the overall presentation of the News Nation egg-shaped thing and all that. How did you feel about that? Did you
It's
watch
probably
that?
real. Yeah, I think it's real.
Yeah.
It's not, but remember, these entities have the power to conjure up matter in many forms. So it's almost hilarious. As as Gary Nolan said, these things seem to have a sense of humor. So think about what Jake Barber just presented. He presented an egg. What's that referencing? What symbolism is that referencing? Idea of an Easter egg hunt.
Yep.
So these entities are literally dropping little eggs for us to go out and find. And then we can poke at it thinking it's a spaceship or it's something technology. But it's not a technology. It's just some material that they conjured up. So that's what they'll play with people. They'll put random symbols on it. So that's why we have to be very careful. We have to ask the simple logical question: are we going to encounter the God? If both exist, extraterrestrial civilizations and gods, which one are you going to encounter first?
So you're saying these things
gods.
don't. Right. You're saying these things don't crash. So how did we subdue that egg through psionics, I suppose, or what?
Yeah, well, that's basically what's his name, Jake or Jack?
That's what Jake said.
Jake.
Yeah, Jake was basically saying, I think the CIA has known about this because they probably learned it from the Nazis originally, that you can summon these things. I have physically done it. So you can try to summon. This is the principle of the jinn, the genie. Summoning the genie to get some kind of wish. This is dangerous because most of these genies are demonic or jinns. So they will play with us. So no, yeah, now Jake seemed to reference that he felt a sense of love. Like there wasn't any fear. In my case, it was fear. So I do think there are angels that are going to drop some Easter eggs for us. And there are demons that might also drop some eggs. But the demons might drop again, it's not like some master plan where Satan and all the demons are getting together. No, because these demons are they're trapped in their pure hatred of humanity.
Yep.
The idea that humans, when we die, become like a god. This is kind of what the Egyptians believed. The Egyptians basically believed that's why the pharaohs emphasized that I am like a god, I am a demigod, because I know when I die, I will be reformed. So I think Gregory Little came on your show. I think he talked about how Native Americans kind of also believe this idea that there really is a reforming of the body that literally happens. And the Egyptians believe this to a very extreme extent. Now, Catholics realize that, okay, well, you don't need to necessarily preserve the body to reincarnate into another dimension. I love when he said that there's a chance that some Native Americans believe that there is reincarnation, but not everybody is reincarnated. It depends on your soul. I think that's very interesting. I think some Catholic theologians would be open to that possibility. But again, it's dependent on the circumstance of the person. So I wouldn't take a bet that you're going to come back to Earth and get a second chance. You don't take that bet. Just try to strive to get up to the dimension of heaven, the next nirvana.
Right.
I'm actually on my 5th try right now. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So you commented on the Greg Little video about remote viewing being BS, and I don't. Like,
I shouldn't say that.
I said I don't have an opinion one way or the other, but if we're believing in psionics and stuff, why can't we believe in remote viewing?
Because
go ahead. No, you go.
Because it's not the viewer that has the power. Remember, it's like Stranger Things. Vecna has the power to detect you. These entities move at the speed of light. So if you start shining, this is what I did. I shined a flashlight, repeated over and over. It took 3 weekends in a row to do it. Eventually, I started getting a response, flashback. It took some time. It's not like, I think some people might be gifted. There's stories in the Bible where Moses was gifted with powers, but it's not intrinsically his power. Okay, I don't have the power as much as I try to focus on levitating this mouse, this keyboard or whatever. I can't do it within 1 second. But if I took a year to try, maybe some entity will give me that power. So,
Mhm.
for example, there's the case of a Buddhist monk in Tibet. There's a magician. I remember it was a documentary on Discovery Channel. This magician wanted to visit this Buddhist monk because people claim that he could levitate freely. And I think I've looked at the video over and over. I don't think the Buddhist monk is getting paid by the documentary channel to fake this. They made sure that he wasn't sitting on a chair. He didn't travel to Hollywood. They traveled to him. They paid the money to go see this famous monk in Tibet. And this monk said, no, I just simply, I meditate, I pray, I guess you could say, to God, to the Dharma. And if your intentions are really good, sometimes, your guardian angel, and he didn't say guardian angel, but the Catholics would say this is probably his guardian angel levitating him. It's not his power. We are bound by the laws of physics until we're dead, and then we might be granted a godlike state or an angel. That's the case of the so-called apparitions of Mary. Did you see that? What that DOD document was called?
Yep.
What was that document called? Do you remember that?
I don't
Which
know.
one?
It was
Sorry.
okay. At the congressional hearing, Luna said immaculate constellation. That's the phrase.
Right. Yeah.
I find that as a Catholic, I find that I know what they're getting at, because many Americans don't know about these so-called Marian apparitions.
Yep.
Yeah. So there was a case in Egypt in 1967, I believe. Thousands of people saw this over a period of a year or two.
Yep.
And even Nasser, the president of Egypt, declared this as a real paranormal event. It happened in a cultic church in Cairo, and multiple eyewitnesses have come out, electricians, whoever, truck drivers. They said, yeah, we saw this blob of light that had the silhouette of a woman, and in some cases it formed very clearly as a woman. Now, we don't know if that's truly Mary. It could be, but if that truly is Mary or Maria, then does that mean Mary is a UAP? What do you call it? A non-human intelligence? Or is this correlating to what the Egyptians have always believed, that humans can become like these gods, but they're not the big God. The big God is the Almighty Father that Jesus says. So even this is where I'm a little conflicted, with my faith a little bit here. I kind of agree with Muslims that Jesus never claimed to be the Father. He is more like an angel. Now, some Muslims don't believe Jesus is an angel. They call him prophet, but some have argued that there's a chance we could categorize Jesus as like an angel. The question is, we don't have video evidence, so it's up to faith, okay, back in the ancient times. But we can look to the Marian apparitions and try to understand what the heck was going on in Egypt, what was going on at Fatima, what was going on in South Korea. But these apparitions are popping up, and the CIA would call these UAP events. 100% categorized as UAPs, and the Vatican is investigating these things. Of course, the Vatican is not going to jump to say, "Oh, that's Mary." They have to be very careful because they know demons can deceive people. So they have to look at the context. How many witnesses are there? Like this, so far they haven't declared the case in Japan. There's a woman there that claimed to see the Virgin Mary, and other witnesses. The Virgin Mary, as like in the statue, was weeping, things like that. But it wasn't strong enough cases so the Vatican hasn't declared it a full apparition. There's only I think maybe 10 or 12 main apparitions going back 300 or 400 years. And it's not just happening to Christians, it's happening to Muslims. So it's strange, but the question is, I use Nadia as kind of a symbol of the Virgin Mary, a Palestinian Egyptian Jew that descended from Egypt, from the Garden of Eden. And we have to be aware of certain messages that the supernatural does leak out, like the crop circle in England by these so-called fairy orbs. I believe this was a legit crop circle, and it said, beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises, much pain, still time. There is good out there. We oppose deception, conduit closing.
That one has to be legit.
Disturbing.
There's no way you could fake that one. Just with that one has to be legit, in my opinion.
It was a very complicated crop circle, and there was 3.
It's not even a
It
circle.
was too
It's-
complicated. Yeah, it wasn't even a circle. It was a
right,
picture.
right, yeah.
So if you looked at the alien image, it's interesting. It's a test. If you think about it, who is the holding the false gifts? Is it the gray alien as a deceiver? Because it's holding the disc that has the message. So who is bearing the false gift? They're playing a test on us or a game. The gods, like Plato said, the gods like. Well, he didn't say it like this, but he basically saying the gods like to fuck with people. Okay, so we have to be careful because there are some gods or angels and demons that might be more in the middle, and I think that's what the Muslims say is that some of the jinns are not purely demonic, but they're more like humans where they're kind of stuck in the middle, but they're spirits, but they like to play with humans. Another hypothesis is that these UAPs are past humans. People say future humans. I don't.
Future, past, those are both. Yeah, there's like.
I would say past, not future. You can't really. Time is always moving up, even for the supernatural. I think it's just immortally moving in time. So I think more than likely, as humans die, certain humans like saints, monks, Buddhist priests, whatever, some of them might become these UAPs. And that's what China believes in these so-called ancestor worship, because they believe their ancestors become like these gods.
Yeah, even like just the idea of the fairy, you think of like Tinkerbell, but really a Scottish fairy is a trickster, right? Somebody you don't trust, you know what I mean?
Yeah, the original author depicted the character as a ball of light. It was never a woman. That was something Disney did, just for entertainment reasons, and it was an attractive character. So I think the original author never gave it a sex, because angels don't really have a sex because they can change in different avatar bodies. So it's a very disturbing phenomenon, and I sure hope I hope I'm wrong on this. But the Catholics and the Muslims, they're all saying, yeah, we've been telling you about the interdimensional spirits for about 2,000 years. So, and the Egyptians surely believed that they were literal gods. So I think I'm going to take the Egyptians pretty seriously. People like to say, oh, they were superstitious. No, they had a very sophisticated system. Monotheism basically was born from Egypt under Akhenaten. And they realize that there's one big god that controls the laws of the universe and everything. And then there are lesser gods, and they're kind of like the viruses. The demons are like the viruses in the simulation. We are in the big simulation that God created, the program of the computer. And then you got these little angels or demons who might be viruses or good viruses, I guess. And they interfere in the program once in a while.
That's why you got to be careful about what emails you open. Dave and I try to be very cautious, like you said.
Yeah, so don't open your mind up to psionics. Psionics is, if it's revealed that this is a very real scientific thing that can be proven, there will be laws banning it, and you will be put into prison because it's a very dangerous thing to do. Because psionic, you don't know if you're going to get the demon or the angel. It all depends on your state of mind. What do you believe? Your intentions, your pride, all that stuff is weighed by this entity out there, and they will play tricks with people. And sometimes it will lead to some serious bad stuff like cattle mutilations, missing 411, and very disturbing things. That's why Tucker Carlson did not want to talk about it. He's just like, oh God. He knew that this was now. I don't agree with Tucker Carlson and everything. Again, I believe in evolution. He doesn't. You can have both evolution and the supernatural. Okay. But Tucker Carlson figured this out real quickly that, when he got briefed on this, he's like, okay, yeah, this sounds something that's very religious in its origin. And it's not spaceships with technology. So every time people look at a UFO, they assume that's technology. But do you call a bird technology when you see it fly? No, it's a creature. So we have to really analyze these case files and see what the pattern is, and it's so deep and it goes back so far in history. It just doesn't make logical sense that this would be extraterrestrials, because they've only found 6,000 exoplanets. Of the 6,000, not even 1% are categorized to be super habitable, meaning actually having plants. That's a very tiny sample. They've already got 6,000 and they're increasing. the number of exoplanets, but the rate of super habitables hasn't changed. There's only like 12 they've categorized them potentially, and they can't prove it. NASA can't prove it.
What if you expand that though, like across, billions of stars and billions of galaxies? Like then the rate starts to mean a little bit more, right?
Not necessarily, because there's something called the galactic habitable zone.
Mhm.
That's a new theory that started popping up in the 2000s, and they've said that if you're too close to the supermassive black hole, there's too much chaos between the stars and the gravity. So we're actually in a habitable zone within a galaxy. So that eliminates 1/4 of all the stars right there within one galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
So there are other planets out there. I mean, just look at Venus. There's a very high probability that Venus may have actually been just like Earth, with a full type 1 civilization like ourselves, or type 0.85, whatever. Yeah, there's a very high probability, because they detected the signature of phosphine, they detected signature of granite, they just got to prove it. And there's a chance that Venus had a moon, and the moon might have been Mercury. That's one hypothesis. So, but Venus is separated from Earth by the last time Venus they think may have had life was around 500 or 600 million years ago. And what is that period? Well, that's right around the time Earth has the Cambrian explosion of life, around 500 to 600 million years ago. So that's when Venus starts to die. So it's very interesting to see that correlation, because the sun is expanding and the temperature is getting hotter over time. Like if it increases by 3% of the sun's luminosity, we're dead. So Venus, it's like, people live and they die, and that might happen to the majority of planets. Might be type 1 or lower civilizations, and they're all stuck. 99% might be stuck. Rarely do you ever get type 2.
Yeah. What
sad reality.
What classifies type 1? Type 1 is when we can control like the energy of the entire planet, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a little exaggerated. I would just say type 1 civilization is when you discover oil.
Okay.
I think that's
a pretty good.
A global, when you have, we have the UN right now, the idea of world government, people are pushing for it, people are fighting against it. You have a globalized world, and we have pretty much reached that point. And then there's a point to where, anthropogenic climate change might start to be one of the great filters that tries to slowly kill us. Like Carl Sagan said, like the Earth's lifespan, like our civilization, is like 1 second of 365 days of the Earth's lifespan. What happens in this next second? Like we just assume we're going to perpetually grow our GDP infinitely until we get out to Pluto. There's already news about a potential asteroid coming. It's a small one. I mean, it's pretty big.
Covered that. We don't.
It's a decent chance.
We don't want to listen to
3% chance, 5.
Yeah, it's awareness is good.
That's close enough. Yeah, we've been talking about that a lot on our live stream. Peter, really fascinating presentation, man. I really appreciate you bringing this. I've been taking notes. There's a lot of stuff I want to look up that you said. Very interesting, man.
Your slides
thanks
were
for having
organized. Me. It was well prepared, so this was great to meet you.
Yeah, again, give credit to those main 4 researchers. I have their essays on my channel as just a entertaining kind of AI audio essay. So those are the first real researchers who are pretty rational, and they're not making large outlandish claims about civilization. They're just saying we have evidence that there was a supermassive volcano, and all of a sudden we get Plato's story, we have the Hebrew story, and there must be some correlation. And we know that the story of Plato's Atlantis came from Egypt. So we should ask the question, well, is it Egypt then? It's the island. And there's a chance Egypt could be older. I wouldn't rule that out. There's a chance because of Göbekli Tepe. More than likely, people from Göbekli Tepe came down to Egypt. There's a lot of reference to snakes at Göbekli Tepe, so makes you wonder if they were aware of the Nile. And people from Ethiopia came up and interacted. So, yeah, it fits to the anthropological record and historical record pretty close. So I wish academics, would actually look into this, but there's such a stigma, just like UFOs has a stigma
Mhm,
meaning
mhm.
aliens every time. There's a stigma on Atlantis because of the Nazis. Geopolitics has really tainted Plato's story and Hollywood, of course.
Right.
Just gotta
I
think
did-
rationally. And
I do appreciate this slide with the 4 sources. It's been so many times where I'm listening to a podcast or show and I scribbled down a source they mentioned and I lose track of it. So cool slide. Thought
Yeah.
I'd show it again here at the end.
Yeah, I
Right.
also
Yeah,
wanted
thank
to
you.
find out if possible you could direct me towards the video of the big.
I will be sharing a video compilation from the YouTube channel Suspect Sky.
Okay.
I put the compilation together for him, and he'll be putting that out pretty soon because of the Age of Disclosure documentary will be popping out too. So we're trying to get onto
Mhm.
that timeline,
Awesome.
get some views on that. But it's in that video compilation. I'll send you guys that. The channel is called Suspect Sky. I've made 3 videos for him,
cool.
and we collaboration.
So really quick before I
That's great.
let you go, in your opinion, if we go to Contact in the Desert and do their CE5 contact program, are we opening the gateway to like possibly the bad demons coming into our neurons or what?
You can do it at your house. It doesn't matter where the location is. I don't recommend doing it at your house. There's a chance, yeah, but it depends if you're aware that there are yin and yang entities out there, and you are trying to focus your mind very clearly. I want to see a good angel or a good spirit, whatever, something positive, because there are cases that people have experienced something very positive. There's a case in the UK where a whole family saw a white orb similar to one over Jerusalem, which is not fake. That is definitely a real event that happened in 2011. This family in the UK said that they didn't feel any fear. It was so odd. The older lady was saying that she felt a sensation of love in her head. It was so weird. She's like, something was altering the chemicals in my brain to feel this sensation. But we have to be careful about feelings. We need to judge judge the entity's behavior over time, because it might, it could play tricks. That's a problem when you're dealing with the gods. Because what's the lesson of fairy tales? In the original fairy tales, the Grimm's fairy tales, never trust the fairies.
I think that's a good place to call it. That's perfect, man.
That was a fun show.
Yeah, very
Thanks,
fun.
guys.